psychologist, licensed psychologist, and he is also family therapist and neurofeedback therapist, and he's been using neurofeedback since 1987. Matthew is co-director of Neurofeedback Advocacy Project, that is topic of his talk today. And the mission of Neurofeedback Advocacy Project is to bring neurofeedback to services that serve clients who are underprivileged, many of them, of course, traumatized, and to train clinicians to use neurofeedback and also then to gather data together so that over time we have a large database of the whole process of neurofeedback sessions, and that we can all as a clinical field learn from that, and also that we can then advocate for use of neurofeedback in other services that are still not implementing neurofeedback. All of us here are neurofeedback providers, and we are all interested to continue to develop our practices. But one of the reasons why I really wanted Matt to talk to us is that there is a power in data that we can all collect together. And that is much easier than to talk to funding bodies, but also we can learn through that process and get better informed about what protocols work for our clients, for what symptoms it works, how long it takes to see progress in treatment, all those questions that we have as clinicians, especially those who are new to the field. And Matthew, I think that the project that you have is really a project that will help us as a field grow. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Marana. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm trying to remember the year. I think I told you, but I was in Australia more than 20 years ago. Came over to do a course, and then everybody was so hospitable, had a wonderful time that, we have one of those, my wife has one of those slideshows that goes through her computer, and up popped the Australian visit slide. So
Yeah.
I feel like I'm talking to a friendly audience. So I'm going to switch now over to sharing my screen. And I want to share this. And I want to share keychain preview. Where'd it go? I think that's it. Yeah. Okay, and then I'm going to go to my slideshow. So let me see, I want to be able to see something of people. And I'm going to get rid of that and get rid of that. So just to check, everybody should be looking at a screen that says Introducing the Neurofeedback Advocacy Project? Okay, great. So, and then the question is, what do you do with this thing here? Okay, good. So today I want to talk about really two things, the Neurofeedback Advocacy Project and the results tracking system. And okay, so some of this might be interesting in the sense that what I did is I took a slideshow that when I go to agency people, in other words, prospective users, because the project is about trying to talk agencies into taking on neurofeedback. And I know every country differs. I think there's a belief in the world that the U.S. doesn't provide mental health services to poor people. It's not actually the case. What we don't have is an organized and unified delivery of care. But a lot of people who are low income get their health care access through what's called the Medicaid system. And so that's taxpayer supported. We also, the federal government gives subsidies to people based on income to buy into private health care. So going back over the last few years, but particularly under President Obama and then President Biden, that's been increased. So most states, most people have access. Again, you have to be a citizen. There are a few states that are controlled by the Republican Party, and some of those have resisted extending it. But in I think it comes up to about 95% of Americans have access to health insurance. It's not the undocumented, they would not. So the presentation I make to them is, first off, what if mental health care could be so much better? Because I don't know what it's like in your country, but in this country, even when we have services, they're not very good. And what I mean by that is the outcomes aren't very good. The other thing, so leading on is, what if people could get dramatically better results with all their clients? And here I'm talking about particularly the most difficult clients. We may do fairly well with, your minor, depression and anxiety, but when people have serious problems, our outcomes are not very good. And also, what if clinicians found their work really professionally rewarding without being exhausting or leaving them on the verge of burnout? And I don't know what the situation is in Australia, but here, COVID is both spiked demand for services, exhausted practitioners, and people working with the underserved are actually being poached by other agencies and other providers to come and work with them in more for-profit centers, and stripping out the personnel who would work in these places. So, and then the last thing is, like I said, most mental health care is on a fee-for-service basis, even in an agency. If you see the client for an hour, you then bill Medicaid for that hour of therapy. And so the question when I go to agencies is, what if we could introduce a change that actually resulted in them having a lot more money without having to change their billing or their staffing or anything? So it's kind of on three levels: better clinical outcomes with the clients, happier therapists, and agencies that are financially in a stronger position. Because if any of those three are not there, you don't get better outcomes, you're not, therapists can't stand it, or the agency can't afford it, it's not going to go forward. So this brings up what the Neurofeedback Project is. And so basically it's something that I started. I've been doing neurofeedback, as Marana said, for about 35 years. I've done it. I've taught it. And what I wanted to take it out to make sure that one day neurofeedback would be fully integrated into mental health systems and widely available to anyone who needs it. So that's basically the mission. And that I did it because essentially I was frustrated, that the slow pace of which neurofeedback is rolled out. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but it's still an uphill slog to get people to recognize this. And that where it was getting out was in the fee-for-service people, those who could afford to pay for it out of pocket. And where it wasn't getting to was the people who in particular benefit from it. So that was the impetus. I've got to see I'm going to go back just a second, but the backstory on this is several years ago, I had several systems. I was starting to wind down my clinical practice. And so I went to three agencies. Well, no, two things happened. One was an agency got into doing neurofeedback, and they got Medicaid to pay for it as just part of psychotherapy. And suddenly they had 10 therapists on their staff doing it, and they had a waiting list of 200 clients at all times. Clients were telling other people, hey, you ought to go here and get help. So that told me that it could scale up. The other thing is I had a friend, she was a clinician, who had gotten a head injury, and I had treated her with neurofeedback, and now she was back working. And I said, you ought to get into doing neurofeedback. So she said, okay. Went off, got trained, bought a system, and then she got a job at the county. I don't know if you have counties, but it's a local political division, which healthcare is often provided through. And she worked in their forensics unit of their behavioral health unit. So forensics means these are people who would have gone to prison, but the judicial system said they're not crimes of intention. These are people with serious mental illness who have impulse control and poor judgment. and there's no deterring them by sending them to prison. So let's see if we can't do some therapy with them. So they are remanded into therapy. She had these clients. She started doing this. They said, well, she asked, can I do neurofeedback? And they said, we don't care, or something elegant like that. So she did. And two things. One is everybody started reporting, what are you doing to these people? What do you mean, what am I doing to them? She says, well, these people have been coming to groups for years, and now they're talking, and they're making sense, and their affect looks more reasonable, and suddenly they're showing insight in chronic severe mental illness. And at the same point, their no-show rate, and remember, these people legally remanded to show up, was not 28%. They missed 28% of their appointments. Either car won't start, the dog, I don't know, the car won't start, my kids are sick, I can't get going, I don't feel well, whatever excuse, because you can't say I don't want to come, you're remanded, so you make up an excuse. Or they cancel at the last minute. The normal was 28%. Her no-show rate was 3%. And the complaint that they kept getting when they called in is, why aren't you scheduling me more often in to see Julia? So people took notice of that. And so these two events led me to say, okay, I think we can scale it because we can get it paid for. And I think we can put it into the hardest type of population you can get. And let's see. So I went to 3 agencies and I said to them, here's the deal. I will lend you my extra equipment if you will send 2 staff and 1 supervisor to training. So each of these groups flew down to Los Angeles to get the training for a week, came back and implemented. So that's the backstory on the project. Never take on a side project like this. My advice to you, it gets out of hand. Anyhow, the project soon really became 2 synergistic projects. One was the Neurofeedback Advocacy Project. That's where we go out and we try to figure out how to entice people, agencies now, to do neurofeedback with their clients. It's a lot of phone calls, social media. We've tried everything and anything, but basically it's a lot of shoe leather. But we're getting there. We're figuring this out. So that's the project. But the other thing was, it's not enough to just put a project like this into agencies, because eventually there's enough staff turnover, people leave, funds get cut, the project dies. What's really important is to collect real-time, meaningful data on the impact of this, because that's what then convinces other people. And so these 2 pieces, the NAP, Neurofeedback Advocacy Project, and the RTS, Results Tracking System, that's what I called it, are the 2 pieces that we created. So the part of the NAP is finding out what works. So, maybe you'll do something like this in Australia. There is no cookie cutter model that works everywhere. Agencies are different, target populations are different, who they hire, who they treat is different, how they get their money is different. So in a sense, what you're trying to figure out all the different ways that you can get this out there, that you can do it efficiently and that you can scale it. So the NAP is really about looking about how do we recruit people, how do we scale it. The results tracking system is an online data collection system, because I know that neurofeedback has been placed in lots of places, and then later on, they never get the data out of there. In the US, the military has been doing neurofeedback for years. They have data, but they won't release it. And so this case, my decision was, I'll solve that problem because I'll hold the data. If they quit the program, I've got the results. So I'm like Google. I give you free access to the web browser, but I keep the data of what you look at. Okay, except I'm not nefarious on this. And also that we had to make it here, it's called HIPAA compliance. So those are the rules on the protection of confidential medical information. So one advantage of using Google platforms like Google Sheets is it's actually HIPAA compliant depending on how you do it, but it's encrypted. And as long as you don't use real names and identifiers, it's not hard to make it that way. The other thing is I had to make the data collection good enough that the therapists and the clients would be willing to use it, because if there's the first thing that clinicians hate, it's more paperwork. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but in here, people are drowned, and if the government is paying for it, they will definitely give you more paperwork. So, and then finally, it had to be robust and flexible and scalable. So when we started this out, we had 3 agencies. I literally hand entered it. Me and somebody else took about 5 half days to hand enter all the data. But now the system is built that literally we could have tens of thousands of therapists entering the data. It just happens. So this is the power of, software. So in creating a data tracking system, there were several considerations. One is, we have a pretty fragmented field. People go in to treat PTSD, or they go in to see anxiety, or they go in to see depression or pain or head injury. But if you're doing neurofeedback, you're likely treating all of those. Now, not every client has all of those, but every client may have several of them. So one is I needed a way of tracking outcomes that was covered all diagnoses and all concerns. And secondly, if you give people 40 outcome measures or 5 outcome measures, doesn't work. I needed a single valid outcome measure, and then I also needed some other measures that added to it. So the other thing is, if you're collecting outcome data, you need some data on the clients, who they are, the demographics, but also a measure of how difficult they are. Because one of the arguments for neurofeedback is how well it works with extremely difficult clients. So it had to measure that. Also wanted measures of cost benefit, because remember I talked before about how the SCAL had a 3% no-show rate. That's a cost benefit, because when you go to take neurofeedback to anywhere, the first question they're going to ask you is, how much does it cost? And then you're saying, well, the amps are this, and this is this, and then you just sort of see them losing interest, because I've never met a mental health agency that was on a plushy budget. They're all hard-pressed. They're all shoestring operations. And we're trying to change the conversation around to say it doesn't cost, it actually pays. We have to have that data. And then finally, you want a data collection system to be somewhat illustrative of the relationship between protocols and what you're doing. In other words, the problem right now is people give a baseline measure of something, they do so many sessions, and then they do another measure, and there's no real connection between what they did in the session and the outcome that they got. And this is true in mental health across the board, and it's certainly true in neurofeedback. We have not advanced very far in what we do, and you can't advance unless you get feedback. It's really interesting that a field called neurofeedback, or EEG biofeedback, or feedback's in our name, does not really use any feedback mechanisms. And so in here, they're built in. So what do we got? This is kind of the heart of the system. Basically, what we ask is, after you've done your intake and you get your basic information and you get down, you finally say to your client, okay, what do you hope will get better? What are the concerns in your life that you're hoping doing this will improve? And what you see here across the top, and let me see, 1 second, I don't know who that is, but basically, that's what goes across the top of this form. And actually, when I came here, I think I'm going to say 20 years ago, I brought a paper and pencil version of this form. I think, Marana, you're using it, right?
Yes, we are still using it. I'm embarrassed to say that.
No, you shouldn't be embarrassed, because the idea was there. I tried to, back then, I tried to convert it into a digital thing. It wasn't possible. But now, Google Sheets exists, and if you look at this, you can see it's a Google spreadsheet. And the way it works is, one is the client picks out their concerns. They get entered here across the top. We wanted a baseline, but you can't really easily get a baseline in private practice or any practice because the client does not want to come for several sessions where all you do is collect starting data. They want to intervene right away. So for a baseline, we ask clients to rate whatever the problem is on a bad week, a good week, and a usual week. And we take those 3 points and we average them together, and they say, well, that's the starting point. On each of these, we have a 0 to 10 scoring system. It's a Likert scale, so 10 says mammoth problem, huge, difficult problem. And 0 says it's not a problem anymore. It's kind of intuitive, and the way it's scored is the client checks off the box in that group, that row, that indicates what the score is. So basically, you hand this to the client. You can put it up on the screen that they get the feedback on. You can, if you're using a computer system, you just slide this window over there, give them a mouse, and they can click. You can also, it'll open up on an iPad or an Android tablet. Again, modern miracle. And by the way, these are all free programs, so Google stuff is free. So they just click. And one of the things here is that by laying it out like this, you can actually see visually, you can actually see changes because as people get better, the numbers drift to the left. As they go down, each one of these rows is a session, and within a group, you can see here, this one they got better, they suddenly got a little bit worse, and then they got better again. On this row over here, you can see an initial improvement and sort of stable, and then got a little bit better, and then they sort of plateaued for a long time on that. Okay? And then we also track no-shows. So for example, right here, if a client was supposed to come in and didn't come in, you enter NS. The computer will keep track of how many of them and how many sessions you have, and that gets a percentage of no-shows. So the other thing is we use the client's wording for concerns. So you ask the client, in your own words, what's wrong? That's the heart of the system. And the way we collect and calculate improvement is we take the average of this compared to the average of the last 3 sessions. So that gives improvement. Let me go to the next page. So I want to show you now some data, and then I'll come back and I'll show you some more things in the project. So the first thing I want to show you is we have this system. What were the clients? Well, maybe, okay, let me do it this way. So the first thing we do is we collected information on our clients. Who are they? Or not, I say our clients, but they're not mine. They're clients out in agencies. I don't have clients. These are clients from the agencies. And the first thing we have is this is actually published on our website. So you could go there now and see exactly what I'm doing here. And our website is neurofeedbackadvocacyproject.com. So you can see for our agencies, it's about 60% adults, almost 40% kids, a little sliver of seniors. Slightly about more females than males. Why didn't that, for some reason it left off I have to go see why that isn't there. But we are treating men, and I think that's important because in a lot of places, men are reluctant to go to therapy. They create much of the harm, but unwilling to get much of the therapy for it. So, this shows that we do well. Percent on medication, 65%, if I round up, are on medication, 35% are not. This is a new feature, but we're keeping track of the children who are, quote, in the system. Adoption, foster care, juvenile justice, special education, child welfare. In other words, because one of our targets is if we can reach kids, we can head off a life of misery Where if we get adults, then we're trying to fix things later. We work well with both, but this is who we go with. This one is ACEs scores. I don't know, is everybody here familiar with ACEs? But you can see our average ACE score now is 4.6. Anything over 4 is severe. And this over here is the number of psychosocial stressors. So this is, you get a point for, serious family problems. You get a point if you have major medical problems. You get a point if economically you're really hard pressed. You just add up the points. And you can see that our clients have an average of 4.2, which is a lot. Then we have co-occurring disorders. So within the system that I use, if people report several issues around pain, that's one disorder. And then they report several issues around can't focus or impulsive or can't concentrate, that's the next other one. And then if they say they don't sleep very well, that's another one. So those are the number of, in a sense, problem areas. And our clients report that they have on an average 5 problem areas per client. That's a lot. These are not simply people who walk in and say, I'm anxious. They're anxious, can't sleep, are in pain, can't focus, whatever. And then finally, we keep data on race and ethnicity. And the project started in Oregon. Oregon is within the United States has one of the smallest non-white populations. Now that we're in Los Angeles, I looked at the data there. The data matches the demographics. So in there, the largest group of people in the agencies were Hispanic, and then followed by black, white and black and Asian. In other words, we have no reason to believe that this does not work with any ethnic ethnicity is not an issue, but we want that data. Okay, so let's show you, I told you the data we collect. Let me show you the results that we get. So the first thing we get is, remember, people asked what's their concerns. They labeled their concerns. At baseline, their concern has not improved. That's baseline. By 10 sessions, they are reporting a 23% improvement in their concerns. And now this is important. It's their concerns and their ratings. And so from that, they're getting a 23%. And if you hover over there, this is based on 526 clients. So, you see these studies, 12 clients were in the control group and 12 clients were in the active group, so they got 12 active clients. I think 20 sessions is a good measure. And we have 301 clients who have now reached 20 sessions. Okay. And then we go out to, 30 sessions. And they keep getting better. Now, the numbers drop because there's no fixed length. Neurofeedback is not a 10-session or 20-session treatment. So it kind of looks like, if you really want to get an intervention and get the most bang for the buck, if you will, 20 sessions is pretty good. But a lot of clients go beyond that. It's their willingness. It's the willingness of the Medicaid reviewers to say, yep, but this is what we get. Let's look at the other behavior. So we asked clients prior to coming in, the year before, were you either suicidal, did you have suicidal thoughts, or were you into self-harm? And 37% of agency clients said they were, one of those two. And then we asked, what percentage were of that same group? Now, again, we're comparing the numbers in that first group, 20 sessions later, how many of you are still having suicidal thoughts or self-harm? It's now 18%. I wish I could say it was 0% or 2%. It's 18%. So it's essentially, that is a 51% reduction in 20 sessions. I think that's impressive. The arrests and incarcerations, we were into a program that dealt with men and women who had just been released from prison, but COVID really affected their services because anyhow, COVID just ran through prisons in the United States. So they went on a strictly, they only work with people, they're all released, but they almost entirely work with people at a distance, telehealth. And we didn't do neurofeedback. We have one agency that did neurofeedback with telehealth. But look at this one on the right, disciplinary actions at school. Okay, we have 44 kids whose parents said, yep, in the last year there have been discipline actions at school. After 20 sessions, that number dropped to 18%. That's a 67% reduction in disciplinary action. Okay, moving on. Drugs and alcohol. I don't need to read all these numbers, but nobody's being relapsing during 20 sessions. In other words, I think we are really getting somewhere with that. Now, I don't view neurofeedback as the sole treatment, but these are people in treatment for something, probably substance abuse. They're not just getting neurofeedback, they get counseling groups or whatever that agency does, but you can see the impact. Now, here's interesting. We also asked about nicotine use, and we got a small improvement. Actually, I'm pleased that we only got a small improvement, because if people were simply telling us that what they thought we wanted to hear, then nicotine use would have gone down to 15 or 20, 12 or 8%. But none of the agencies were making nicotine use the focus of what they did. People smoked, let them smoke. So this is good. And in several of the states we're in, including Oregon, medical marijuana is legal. I didn't want to ask about illicit drugs because I didn't want to be guaranteed. I couldn't trust the data, but I thought people might be willing to report. 19% report they're using marijuana. At the 20 sessions, it's still 19%. So we haven't changed that either. Now, maybe we could talk to therapists about, do you want to address that or not? But, again, neurofeedback is not a demand for abstinence. It's a treatment program. We gave the quick test, which is like the TOVA or IVA. These are standard scores, and you can see we're getting a 7-point gain. That's a half a standard deviation in accuracy and a third of a standard deviation in performance, but performance was in the normal range and accuracy was not. So this is an objective measure. Okay. Now look at these next four. I talk too much. The stuff is up on the screen. Read what we're measuring there and look at the impact that we're having. Okay, and yet we still sit outside the system as untried and not evidence-based. I wish the other people had data on how evidence-based they were on these measures. But I would not have thought we would get a drop in medical reasons. But again, the underserved, the hard to serve, what are their probably most common medical reasons? Probably diabetic related, unmanaged pain related, I don't know. I don't have the details. But look at psychiatric reasons, even greater. Now, those are ER visits. And one reason I started to collect this is I knew the insurers, since these are expensive things, a medical hospitalization, I think I looked somewhere, is about $8,000 in the United States on average. And poor people don't pay for it. The system pays for it. And then hospitalizations for psychiatric, only 9% had previously been hospitalized, but look at that number now, 0%. That is a huge savings. And we don't have to get to 0%. Okay, I'm going to show a couple other numbers. We asked people at the outset, okay, they gave us a list of how many psychosocial stresses they had, and we asked them, how well do you cope? Is it 1 to 5? 1 is not well at all, and 5 is pretty good. And you can see, or very well, not well to very well. Basically, they were slightly better than not well. Not too good, doc. After 20 sessions, they have raised that up a whole point. So if you look at things like self-efficacy, these people feel they're coping. And later on, you can see some of the comments. You do see people reporting how so much better. They manage their lives better. They manage the stress in their lives better. So here's an interesting thing, the one on the right over here. We asked about taking medications for emotions and pain. And, like I think we said before, about 1/3 of the people, a little bit more, were not on medication, but more were. After 20 sessions, we have not really affected that. Maybe I was hoping better. I think one of the problems is if a client's getting better, the prescribing physician is likely to say, well, they're doing better, so don't stop the medication. But these clients have been on medications for years. So I think that leads to that if you work with clients on medication, you have to work with providers about informing them that they could potentially lower the amount of medication. But, so we got that. We also track side effects. And you can see that there were some patients, 15 who reported mild side effects. You get the numbers by hovering over. And there were 4 patients who had moderate side effects. So 19 out of this group of about 80, I think, that we have the data, all of them resolved. So, and now I do ILF neurofeedback, and ILF neurofeedback can make, in a session, between sessions, can give them side effects. The most common ones are not sleeping so well, too tired, too edgy, too irritable. We can cause that. It just means the protocol needs to be adjusted. And in adjusting it, the side effects go away. But we are actually collecting this data. I actually did have one person who said they had moderate effects and they hadn't gone away. I went and looked at the record, and the client said very distinctly, the side effects went away. The therapist clicked the wrong button. So this is good. And then finally, we asked people, what did you think? Rate neurofeedback. And this is it in neurofeedback. They rated all their therapy pretty good, but they rated it slightly better than the counseling and better than the medication. They actually rated group therapy higher. But the N for the group therapy was just 7 people, where for the neurofeedback, we have 77 of this measure. So, this is just a thought that if you're looking to work with the hard serve, a nice model might be do neurofeedback and combine it with group therapy, because group therapy then gives people the mutual support. Group therapy is not a support group. Group therapy is led by a trained leader. They often have content, support, education, whatever you're trying to teach. So in other words, I think that's an efficient model that we should look into. It's just coming out of this data. And this is what this is telling us. And then finally, we collect reviews, sort of like Amazon. Here's one. My headaches, migraines have gotten so much better. I also feel I have more control of my emotional responses. Anyhow, you can go to the website. And then just the last thing I want to show you, this is Project Metrics. So we have 645 clients in our system. These are active. Look at this is our no-show rate currently, 2%. And this is our premature termination. And what that means is, that's this group up here. We asked people who discontinued, because people do leave therapy without finishing. Why did you leave? And if they left because they moved or lost their insurance or because of COVID, we say that's discontinued, not treatment related. But if they said, I didn't like it, it wasn't helping me, it took too long, my kid refused to come anymore, then we call that treatment related. And so that's what this premature termination is. And in a lot of these populations, premature termination often runs 70-80%. I know I spoke to the Veterans Administration, one of their people, and they said, yeah, for PTSD and trauma, it's well over 60% that the veterans enter into treatment but discontinue. So that's our outcome data. Let me go back to and again, you said, can anybody interrupt? But please interrupt if you have a question or raise your hand. I want to show just a little bit. I know this is a group that's familiar with neurofeedback, but I will post this, the link to this presentation online so that you can see it. These are some of the information. So we have to explain to people what is neurofeedback. And so, can you explain it in 20 words or less? That's kind of the task, because we'll go to an agency and we're speaking to the administrator and say, we'd like to bring in neurofeedback. And they go, huh? What's that? So you're starting at a pretty basic view of it. And we definitely stay out of the neuroscience. You're talking to agency people. Their understanding is psychological, emotional. It's not neuroscience. But the world is receptive now to what we say when we tell them brains are dysregulated by trauma, and neurofeedback can help re-regulate that. And then we use analogies. It's like a musician learns to improve their performance by hearing how they sound, that sort of stuff. And then we have to tell them what happens in a neurofeedback session. This is really, so this is if you're working with Lego patients. I don't know how many of you see Lego patients, but this is ILF, but I don't think it's any different than if it was the higher band training. Basically, a clinician sits here, adjusts some software over here. The client sits here, electrodes are on their head. The electrodes send signals into an amplifier. The amplifier sends it to a computer. The computer then makes adjustments, and that's shown up in feedback on this screen. So it's a continuous loop. That's the feedback. And let me go to the next one. So what sort of neat neurofeedback are we using in the project? So I use infralow frequency neurofeedback. I can answer questions about that. Basically, it shares a common root with the higher band training, which I think is the most common in Australia, the beta SMR thing. The difference is that this was developed largely by Sue and Siegfried Othmer, is that particularly Sue found that as she kept lowering the reward band and lowering the reward band and lowering the reward band, then they had to remanufacture the amplifier to work with this lower and lower signal. The signal eventually drifted out of even the delta band, so that we're working at things down as low as 0.000301 millisecond. So that's an event that happens every, I think, hour and a half, every 2 hours. But we have data shows the brain can process this, and what it became very useful for was particularly traumatized people. But that's not to say that the higher band frequency doesn't work where there either. And I knew Ruth Lanius and Seaburn Fisher have certainly published on work there. And one of the things we're doing is we're making, the results tracking system receptive. And I'll show you how we do this to higher band treatment. I'm not into running horse races, one versus the other. It's more likely I am running that we can kind of figure out when is one optimal and when is the other optimal, but also keeping the whole training procedure not too complicated. Because to take this out into the real world, you're not going to find a lot of neuroscience techies working in agencies. And it's just, that's the world we live in. But ILF, the software, we embed this feedback in YouTube videos, in Netflix, in movie DVDs, and video games that are really pretty sophisticated now. And the advantage of this is we have no trouble holding clients in session, and particularly kids. I've trained kids to watch gamer videos, world's most boring thing, but kids who otherwise you can't get them to come to therapy will come if they get a chance to watch gamer videos. And and I train myself, and I train myself often watching jazz instructional videos, so which would be just as boring to somebody else. What appeals to you is what appeals to you. What's the expression? There's no accounting for taste. So let me go to the next one. So other questions we get is, is neurofeedback evidence-based? And so the way we address that when we go to agencies is this slide has two things. There are currently over 2,400 published papers on neurofeedback in PubMed. So if people say there's no evidence, I tell them, let me tell you how to spell PubMed. And you have a computer, don't you? Now go away. Read this stuff. No, I'm not so snarky, but that's what I want to say. On our website, we have a nice curated list of publications about ILF, but a lot of them aren't about ILF. And they're not only there, but if you click on them, they download and open. So you're not just giving people. The fact is, most of the people who say is there any literature want to see that there's literature. They don't want to read the literature, but being able to show that to them, okay, we're satisfied. And then this other chart over here, this is older, it says just 2000, but this was a distribution of the articles. So you can see a lot more on ADD, ADHD, theoretical, miscellaneous, anxiety, depression, stroke, pain. We really probably, well, back then, if this is 2000, there's probably a lot more on PTSD and trauma because that's an area that neurofeedback has gotten. So if you want to see this, it's on our website. There's a tab about neurofeedback, and then the drop-down menu says published papers. Okay, so the other question that I'm prepared to answer, people are ask is when you go out and tell people, and particularly when you're going to governmental or agency bodies, why isn't this more known? And these are the reasons I've come up with, and this is how I say them because you don't want to be defensive. But the first one, top left, is, at least it's true in the US, but I think it's probably true around the world, that our current mental health care system prioritizes medication first, talk therapy second, and there's little appreciation for the power for a non-invasive, non-verbal treatment. Okay, that's it. It's just not in the, it's starting to creep in, but it's still not widely there. Some of the new apps, some of the new over-the-counter goods, and now transcranial stimulation and, are opening that up. Another reason is this whole field was discovered 60 years ago. There was just little understanding of brain plasticity. And because so many positive things happened, the explanation of all, it's placebo. Okay? And then it came out of outside medical school. So that's the problem, is that if more people with MD behind their name pushed it, it would be better accepted. But for this reason, doctors remain skeptical. They're not trained. It's not part of the medical curriculum. You can't blame them. But if somebody comes and you're supposedly given the state-of-the-art knowledge about something and it doesn't include something like this, then it's assumed that this isn't really very valid. Another one is there are 2,400 published papers, but there are some controlled outcome studies, the research designs that are fully controlled, but not a lot. And one reason is you can't do a double-blind study on a treatment where you have to interact with the patient and ask, what are you experiencing? The double-blind gets blown, within a session or two. And so the researchers are often fine down to a manualized treatment that you can't change anything. There's no discretion in the therapist, but how does the therapist know what sites to use and what frequencies to set unless you're interacting with a client? So our standard medical research designs are great for pills. They're not good for training processes. And then the last one, you can't patent neurofeedback. And because you can't patent it, it's been hard to draw money into the field to do the work. Okay, so I cover that. Oops, let me get this. Oops. Okay, so here we go. So I'm not going to read this slide, but this just gives you a range of the places that we have put it. So we have not found a place that can't make it work. We put it rural, urban, American Indian population. So I know that Australia has indigenous people too. And when the American Indian group got it, they said, well, how are we going to get people to do this? Isn't this, these are very wary people. They've been very mistreated, and this is definitely not part of the native culture. And so one is, you want therapists, you want their therapists. They're sensitive to their clientele. I think the people we've trained, about half are Native American in that group and half are not, but they all want to work there. And basically, we tell them, start with your existing clients. They trust you, and see if you can get a few to do it. And as soon as the first few do it, they will talk to their friends. And once you do that, you no longer have problems getting people. In fact, the agency with American Indians has regularly increased their staff to handle the demand. So you can, I'm thinking, I don't know. But if you take it out to, well, you're talking about refugee populations, those are also people very wary of governmental and services possibly. But once a few get through it, watch other people do it. A kid, I've often had kids stand and watch other kids do it. Oh, that's what it is. Yeah, I get to play that game? Yeah. Oh, okay, I'll do it. So, oops. So what do we hear back? So first off, I don't need to tell you, neurofeedback makes sense to clients. Therapists are often, how am I going to explain this? Clients readily understand that there's something wrong with their brain. They didn't cause it. It's not that they don't choose to be better. It's not that they don't like it, aren't open to advice, but all the advice they've been given hasn't worked very well. So they understand that your brain is dysregulated by what's happened to you. Oh, I can buy that, doc. And then they're, so that makes sense. They like how neurofeedback feels. It doesn't suppress them. It doesn't dull them down. So often, I'm a pretty creative person, but I don't get anything accomplished. What's going to happen to my creativity? Well, you'll still be creative, but now you'll get more accomplished. That. And then the last part is they demonstrate with their feet that they like doing it. The dramatically low no-show rates show that we have no problem with clients. Our obstacle to neurofeedback is not clients. What about therapists? Again, routinely report high satisfaction. You have to pick your therapist with care. The agencies have learned that. They're better at screening. People have to be therapists who are comfortable with a little bit of technology. Often younger people are. If you have older therapists, it could be more of a learning curve than they want. But they like doing it. And here's the interesting part. It's less exhausting than talk therapy all the time. And in fact, the feedback from Europe, where they've done it and done some follow-ups, is that private practitioners are seeing about 30% more clients than they were before they did neurofeedback. And why? Because they were exhausted after 5, and now they can do 6, 7, 8 clients and not go home at the end of they burnt out. So that's what we're hearing. It's less taxing, and the managers report it's a good tool for staff retention in this day. So this one I've already showed you. I just reordered the thing. And I've showed you the impacts, so I don't need to do that. What's it take to learn neurofeedback? So when we go to agencies, that's a big question. And it takes us about 40 hours, spread over several weeks. We actually ship the equipment, or the equipment is shipped to the trainees. They work in pairs, and they train each other as well as with the didactic explanation of how the brain works, what this thing does, and all that. We use the results tracking system, and we also do bi-weekly case staffings online via Zoom, where we have a more experienced clinician, participate in the breakout rooms to see how they do. If you don't do that, the quality will deteriorate real quickly, and you will have some bad outcomes. This is my experience. So you have to do this. The other thing we're learning is the first 30 to 60 days when people leave training, they really need to have their hand held. Almost have somebody they can call on speed dial because they're so nervous about putting electrodes on people. But once you get past that, you just see people get confidence. They're buoyed by the clients who do really well. They become evangelists for the program. In the US, I don't know about billing and how it's paid for, but for people here, we ask that they go to the people who authorize the insurance and say, we want to include it as psychotherapy. It's a tool for stress management, and these clients are extremely stressed. They don't respond to your standard, deep breathing, relaxation. These people are never going to go to a yoga session and whatever. But if you'll let me use this, the other tools work a lot better. And that's why the data on hospitalizations, ER utilization, suicidality, and all that becomes impressive, because then you can say, trust me, I know what I'm doing. I know there are people in the US who are working hard to get neurofeedback codes approved for treatment. I think it should just be part of psychotherapy. Pay for the clinician to see the person to use the things they do well. So that's on that. Maybe a little bit less relevant to you folks. I don't know how you bill. Okay, so what's the cost of not offering neurofeedback? And if you go to our website, we have this chart that's actually active. And basically, I'll show you how it works. Let me just go here. I'm at the website, go to costs and benefits. I go to agency revenue, and it brings this up. And so you ask the agency, what's your current no-show rate? And maybe I'll ask Marana, what's the current no-show rate for people who come in for counseling in the agencies you work? Do you have a guess?
Probably around 30%, for example.
Okay, 30%. So let's say I'm going to make a guess that your no-show rate, if you did neurofeedback, is going to be about like ours. We haven't seen any reason, so we'll say 3%. And let's say you have an agency with 10 therapists, and you put 4 of them to doing this. And I don't know what you get reimbursed by. Do you get reimbursed per session? Is that how it works?
Through Medicare for 10 sessions, $86.
Per session?
Per session, and just for 10 sessions initially.
Okay. What would they reimburse for psychotherapy?
That's the same.
Okay. So I'm going to
for psychologists, not for clinical psychology, but psychologists. I think it's around that.
Okay. So now, and how many therapy sessions does a clinician typically do in a week?
For example, we can say 20, 25. Yeah.
Okay, let's leave 25 in there. So now, wait a second. Why? Got a problem here because it's not showing the magic number. Oh, I am in, well, that's not a great reveal. Okay, so wait a second, maybe just try this. No. This is so used to showing. Let me bring it up. I'm going to go to Safari, and then I'm going to go to here. Let me see if this does it. Go up to here, and then here. Agency revenue. Let me see if this. Okay, there we go. So you gave me 3%, and I'm going to say 4 therapists charging $86 a session and seeing 25 sessions a week. The agency would in a year collect over $100,000 simply by including neurofeedback in the therapy. And I would say back to the agencies, unless they're capping you at 10 sessions for anything, don't think about neurofeedback. Just let me use it. I'm not going to bill you anymore. I don't want to be coded for it. I won't use it for clients who don't need it. If a client can work well with deep breathing, why do this? But the clients that you're working with don't typically do well with deep breathing. They need this. So that's what this is all about. Okay. So let me go back to my presentation. Okay. Okay, so we have that. There we go. So what are our goals, the project goals? So one is we're trying to grow the network in the U.S. what I would think is if there's an NAP Australia, it's something that the Australians create. In other words, a way of encouraging people who could really use this, who are underserved or not served, and this could also include autistic, well, I'm going to show you that, but you reach out to these people and say, I would really like to help you start to do this. Secondly, that you start working on forming partnerships. In other words, organizations like maybe a child welfare or foster care or a refugee program to say, let's work together to put this program in a self-sustaining way within your organization. In other words, your facilitators, you don't want to be running around doing neurofeedback everywhere, but facilitating people to do it. And then lastly, to advocate for the change and to collect the evidence in Australia of what this does so that in turn you get more people to recognize it. It's not just a good idea, it's really something our system needs, at least in the US, and I would assume that's true here. So this is kind of, our current goals. What sort of sectors? And these are just some of the places that could potentially be useful. Community behavioral health, partnerships with schools. In schools, I tend to think the best is to work with mental health agencies that have contracts with schools to go into the school. The equipment's all pretty portable, and work with kids in the school. But, one highly disturbed or acting out kid can really put a burden on a school system. And I don't know what it is in Australia, but in the US, the schools are really pressured not to kick the kid out, to move them into special education, to do whatever they need that the kid receives his public education. And so the schools are stuck with these really disruptive kids, and they want care for them. If you get the care in the school, you have one is the no-show rate is very low because the kid's in school. But that's an idea. Child welfare, veterans, justice, first responders. I don't know what's happening in Australia, but in the US, first responders, particularly police and EMTs, emergency medical people, hospital workers, everybody's just exhausted. And then refugees, we no sooner settle one group of refugees and they're another group of refugees. By the way, our program is in 80 languages. I haven't checked, but I think Ukrainian has to be one of them. I know it is. And then underserved populations. So that could be whatever. And I think of, again, indigenous people would be a logical group to think of. But, I do not know your group, where you would take it, but these are some of the things. So let me go here. And that's basically, that's thoughts, questions.
Man, this is really impressive. I've never seen a better presentation on advocacy. I think you gave us a lot of ammunition, how we can advocate further, because all of us are doing this job. Mm-hmm. But the way how you presented, it's just amazing.
Yes.
I was quite interested in ILF. It's not one I'm familiar with, but it did sound very interesting. And I was wondering if you had any recommendations for books or resources where I could maybe learn a bit more about it.
If you go to our website, there are a couple of papers, for professionals, kind of explaining the logic behind it, the science behind it. Essentially, what the evidence looks like is that when you move out of the delta to beta range and then go down and down and down, that is actually the frequency of the default mode network and the salience networks. Okay. So the difference also, and actually I'm showing you protocols. I could show you what protocols look like in ILF versus protocols in frequency band training or higher frequency training. But in frequency band training, you have a reward and an inhibit.
Yeah.
In ILF, the inhibit is actually the same inhibits you would use, but it's built into the software. You don't adjust it. Basically,
Okay.
you're inhibiting any bursts of activity. But the reward is different. What the reward is ILF treatment is much more like a conductor conducting an orchestra where you can play it too fast or you can play it too slow and the music doesn't sound good. And so what you're doing is the therapist shifts the frequency of the window of the frequency window of the feedback to nudge the brain there and say, how do you like it if we encourage you to run at this speed? And with highly sensitive clients, so who's highly sensitive? Anybody with migraines, irritable bowel,
Autism and ADHD.
ADHD people are not sensitive. They got a brain like a brick. I mean, they are the same every day. They're ADHD, where somebody with migraines has good days and bad days. ADHD people have ADHD days every day.
Sorry.
Yeah, if that makes sense. Okay. So that's one of the major distinctions we make is the underlying thing a problem of arousal management or stability. People with a lot of trauma have problems with arousal management. People with stability problems have problems with stability. And actually you see that. That's the major distinction you learn to make. And then you have people who have both. So we have three groups. One, A group, the B group, and the A and B group. And if it's the A group, typically you start on one place of the head. If it's the B group, you start on another place in the head. And if it's the AB group, you have to do both at the beginning because you have to manage both those things. But the thing about ILF frequency is you set a number and you run it for about 2 minutes and you say, how do you feel? And if they say, I feel okay, you change it. And what you're looking for they say, oh, it doesn't feel so good. What do you mean? They feel tense, they get sleepy, they can't hold their head up. And then you move back up. And then you move and the client goes after about 2 minutes. Yeah, I feel better. What'd you do? I just changed something. Basically, you're shifting the frequency until you find what's optimal for that client. And once you know that, that's pretty steady for the rest of treatment. And then the rest of it is going to different parts on the head depending on, their symptom profile. So it's all 2-channel.
Okay.
And then we have some other things. We do alpha theta, and then we also do something called synchrony training, which is really interesting. You do it with eyes open. You don't feel anything doing it. But for some people with profound trauma, this has been really amazing that people will go through a session out of that who've gone years and they'll suddenly go, I don't know what you did, but this has been the best week of my life. And other people will do it and go, yeah, that was boring. So, and all of this is generated. The key on the ILF work is it's much more been created by a combination of clinical expertise. That was Sue Othmer mostly, and a group of other people, and then a group of hardcore neuroscientists who looked at the brain as a signal processing. So one of the key people two of them, one is he's a physicist, and as a physicist, he used to work for Grumman Missile Command. So he did the physics of rocketry. And the other person was an electrical engineer who also worked he had the prior job. One of his jobs was he was in charge of satellite communication for the European Union. So they are looking at the brain saying, how could the brain possibly process all this information? And they say where we know the most about that is these sort of looking at the brain as a complex signal processing device in a very noisy world, and how that has to work and how you extract information out of it. And then the third group is the engineers who then make the software that works on that. But the latest version of the software, as you come up in the training frequency band out of this ILF infra low, you start coming up and then the software flips and now it's in frequency band training. In other words, it's kind of like Alice through the looking glass. And there is reason to believe that there are conditions, and that's what we're going to explore, like ADD and ADHD. A lot of people with ADD, ADHD have a lot of trauma.
Mm.
But once you start to get a handle on their trauma, they still don't focus very well. And
Mm.
they need the higher frequency band training for that. So the ILF comes to fore in trauma, but the people who are in that are saying, wait a second, there's a ton of literature on frequency band training as being very effective. So now we have to bring the two back together. But they're both symptom based, and that is really good
Mm.
because if you're QEEG based, which is fine, you're not going to take that into agencies. The people who work there are not there, and you're not going to find enough neurotech people to go work in those settings with those clients. So the
Mm.
symptom-based models, I think at this point are the way to go.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matt. Any other question, comments, feedback?
Can I ask Matthew a question? Hi, Matthew, it's Shayla.
Hi, sure.
How are you going? I use infralow frequency, but I was trained in using, ego system before that. And I kind of struggled to understand the frequencies because I had that search for optimal frequency will always kind of stumble me. I was really unsure where that is for a lot of clients. So I will be going down, and then up, and then I spoke with Sue and she goes, oh yeah, go down, and next time go up. And so, yeah, how do you make that sort of decision? Because we know with regular frequencies, like if, you go too high and you get particular symptoms, you can really think in terms of arousal, you know where you're at, what you've done. But with infralow frequencies, I really didn't know. Oftentimes I was confused, is this, under-aroused? Now, did I flip the system, or did I overstimulate somebody or understimulate? It was, maybe I just didn't understand, don't understand arousal that well, but I was really struggling with that. So with some people I had really great success, with others I really struggled.
Yep. Okay, so there's several pieces here. One piece probably is that the software that the Othmers developed in conjunction with the team in Europe is optimized for that. So they built it with that in mind, and the amplifier with that in mind. And so if I ask Bernard about other people's equipment doing ILF software, he says they probably have signal processing problems down in that domain. And he starts to talk a little bit more, and it goes right over my head. But basically says when you're working with a signal that slow, you have to compensate within the hardware of the equipment and the software that processes it to solve those technical problems. So that's one thing. Secondly, a lot of our training is how to get good at asking and observing for that. And if you want, I'll show you a cheat sheet that we would give people that covers this sort of thing. So let me find. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. But sometimes, I would have nonverbal children on a spectrum, and I actually work quite a lot with kids, because for children, it's a lot of observation, and I work with traumatized parents who often can't give me that insight of how their children are. So that was always, the feedback is always hard in my work. By the way, I work with media now, so with the torture and trauma survivors.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me first show you this. Where to go? That's on. Thought I had it. I don't know if I'm in Safari or I think I'm in Chrome, but let me see preview. Why am I having such trouble finding Safari?
But do you know what one of the problems? Because I was in some sessions with Shayla, and we were both struggling to understand with frequency band that we normally train. If it's over aroused, you go down in frequencies. It becomes under aroused, you go up in frequencies, and it's quite easy to understand. But what we found both really difficult is you go down and you get increase in arousal. You go up and you get in, and then you really don't know what is the logic behind and what it means. You know, how are you addressing arousal if you don't know where to go?
Okay. So we have two things. One is that you can start to observe in session and have questions to ask. So for example, one way of going about it in session is ask the client, I want you to tune in on something that you can observe. So one type of thing that a client can tune and observe is either that their brain is thinking. In other words, even as you're talking to them, it's going, yeah, 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 yeah. Or can they observe physical tension in themselves? Or do they have a headache? Or is there any pain in their body? So if they can tune into those things, you can then make the change run for 2 minutes or 3 minutes and then say, has it gotten better or worse? In other words, you first have to tell the client, let's pick something that you can track in session. In other cases, sometimes working with kids, I've worked with kids on the spectrum, you watch, or kids with ADD, ADHD, how fidgety they are. And then as you start doing this, you watch they stop moving. They suddenly become still as they focused in. And then as you go too low, what you notice is they start to become whiny and complaining. In other words, they've drifted from hyperactive to focused and alert to being under-aroused. But you have to see this. So this is part of what our training is about, or the training we do. Also, going back to the results tracking system, is we asked, a lot of times we won't know in the session. So we do something and do it. And then next time the client comes back, we want to know, is it better or worse? And if it's worse, we want to know, how is it worse? And these sort of chart over here, does everybody see this? In other words, if the client reports that they were dizzy or nauseous a lot, that probably suggests you took the reward frequency down too low. However, if they were tense or had muscle spasms, you're still too high, or you're up too high.
So Matthew, sorry, for children who, let's say, get very rigid in their behavior, because I had a boy who was getting really stuck on repeating things quite often. Would you think that was too high? Or stimming too much?
It's probably
because he wanted, like, for example, he had to cross a road a particular number of times, and it was obviously, as you can imagine, how frustrating that would be and dangerous.
Okay.
That sort of, yeah.
Yeah, so if you see OCD, you might look at that as an OCD symptom.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I was thinking. That's too high.
Then it would say in this model, move on down some, keep going. And what's possible now with the SIGNET software is it can go really low. In fact, every year or two, they reconfigure the software so it will go lower and lower, because at a certain point, the migraineurs, we've got them covered, but we're not covering the trauma victims. Okay, now the trauma victims are going lower and lower and they're doing well, but there's a subset of them who might also have personality disorders or something, and they may need to go even lower. In other words, we're just trying to, it's almost, I want to think of getting a horse that is super agitated and bolts at the slightest noise, and you just have to be able to better and better at calming that horse down. But there are other horses, no, you don't need to calm them down that much. The other thing I've seen, if I've trained too low on a child, is after a while, the parents are pleased, the kid's pretty mellow. But then you look and you say, this child does not have that sparkle in his eyes that you want kids to have. And with the experience, you see that and then come back up a bit. So I think what I'm saying is the problem you have is a problem we face. It's not always easy or obvious, um, but you get better at it as you do it because you get better at knowing what's possible. You know, what sort of changes to look for, what sort of questions to ask, and also on the concerns that people around have. If they say that they're depressed, they may not see changes in depression, but you might ask them, what is depression preventing you from doing? And how hard would it be to do that now? And then each time they come in, you can see, are you making small improvements on that? So this is, now this becomes more in the realm of being a good clinician and being able to ask people relevant questions. I don't know if I'm answering your question. It's something we face, but I think in our training we've gotten well enough that people can do it with this difficult population. One advantage of working with difficult clients is you see changes faster. It's often a lot harder to see effect when you're working with people who come in for a simple thing like, you know, I'm kind of depressed. Okay, but when people are not moving, the effect is more obvious. Jill?
I'm wondering, thanks very much, Matt. It's a really an awesome project and a really good presentation. I'm wondering, what are the main kind of themes of pushback that you get from agencies? Are there kind of clusters or themes of the kinds of things that people are saying to you when they're saying, no, we don't want or we can't have neurofeedback in our service? What are the kinds of barriers that you're mostly coming up again, other than the obvious of the kind of outlay of money?
I think the money issue, though, we've tried to make it easy to get in and do it for low cost. I think the biggest one is it's bringing in something new that's really new. You know, people promote all the time the latest wonder. The internet is full of that. So people are skeptical. It's no doubt that if you can get one place to do it that's in communication with other places, they're more likely to do it. Nobody wants to be on the bleeding edge of innovation. And, you know, you're working with people, you're working with staff. There's a lot of things that make change hard. And it is disruptive in the sense of you're training people to do an entirely different thing. If people got this in master's degree programs and it was widely out there, it would be a snap. But we're still in the early phases of, you know, I think if you went to most agencies or most mental health people and say, how much you know about neurofeedback, most of them wouldn't know much at all, if anything. So.
Yes.
Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps Score, has been immensely helpful.
Mm.
Are you familiar with that book?
Yeah, and I think it has made it kind of known to and acceptable to a lot more people. Yeah, I agree.
So I think that's about. It's your Saturday morning. It's time to get out and enjoy, right?
There's a couple of other hands up, Matt. I don't know if you have a couple more minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Shelley, go ahead. And
yeah, I just firstly wanted to say that in terms of your results tracking system, it's really nice. It's beautiful. It's you know, it's very elegant, and I think that's going to really be able to give some big data to be able to show some really positive outcomes for neurofeedback. And I love the way, like, how visual it is. But I just wanted to ask you, in terms of one of the biggest things that I see in terms of the uptake of neurofeedback, particularly in Australia, I don't know if it's the same around the world, is the fact that it doesn't sit in any particular professional body. So there's no training at university level. And I think when people aren't trained in it and they don't hear about it at university, they don't think it's a real thing. I wasn't trained in it as a psychologist, therefore it must be psychobabble. I wasn't trained in it as a doctor, you know, it mustn't be a real thing. I come from the background of neuropsychology. So when I first heard about neurofeedback, I thought, oh, this is neuropsychology. And I was blown away about how few neuropsychologists knew anything about neurofeedback, let alone how few were doing it. And when I talk to neuropsychologists, they actually get quite excited about it. They've never heard of it before, but obviously, you know, the brain, psychology. It's the perfect, sort of, I don't know, convergence of two brilliant ideas in terms of them being able to enact a therapy which isn't done. So what's your opinion and why neuropsychology hasn't taken it up when there are literally zero therapies practically other than a bit of cognitive training that neuropsychologists can do, and why other neurologists and other professions are not jumping on board going, wow, I don't have a treatment for brain injury. Why aren't we jumping on this? I'm blown away by the fact people aren't excited, but they're just not.
Well, you named them all correctly. I mean, one thing you can point out is, at least in the US, the two most prominent science journals are Nature and what's the other one? I think anyway, one of them is Nature. And Nature has a series of subjournals called, one of them is Nature: Neurology. And they had about 4 years ago about a 12-page article on the science of neurofeedback. It was not, is it valid or not? It was the science of it, and included both the EEG and fMRI neurofeedback. And it said, we don't fully know, posited out the theories, but it was never a question. And they said, a lot of holes, there are claims that need to be substantiated, but there was never anything in that journal article said, this is bogus. So that neuroscientists don't know it, maybe because even everybody gets so specialized so quickly that the stuff doesn't get out to them. But the other thing is plate tectonics, that the continents were once one common landmass and had to spread, took 100 years. I read something else that took 300 years. There's an saying in science that science advances one funeral at a time. It's much more likely to have younger scientists and doctors be open to this. And the advent of things like transcranial stimulation, my joke on that is the one, Indian build small fire, stand close, white man builds big fire, stand far away, to keep warm, is kind of like it. Not neurofeedback compared to transcranial. They charge $100,000. Bernard, the guy who created it, says our equipment is more expensive to create than theirs. Theirs is just a magnet with a coil. We have to process a whole lot more, but they get to charge $100,000, which gives it a credibility. And the neurofeedback field is trying to charge $10,000 and being charged it's over. So all these things play in it. I never think the NAP is going to be the solution, but one solution is you get people in the field saying, damn it, I don't care whether it's approved by you. Look at the results we're getting. And that's kind of the model that we're doing with the NAP. At the same time, let the researchers advance. The other piece is one of the consultants we have has really good fingers into our federal government. Our federal government spends a lot of money on child welfare. It really does. And she says, believe it or not, both parties are interested, that both parties are disturbed by mental illness in children, the fate of how children are doing in our culture now, and open to this sort of stuff. So she is saying, we are really in a good position now, she believes, close to a tipping point, not to make it suddenly go statewide, national, big money, but to get politicians to fund the trial projects, to get the data, and not to simply turn it back to universities to do more clinical random control studies. They're looking for what works in the field. So maybe that is something that's going to happen.
But we have one more question, Tim.
Tim?
You're muted, Tim.
Is that better?
Yep.
Yep. Sorry. Thanks, Matt. Really quick question. I noticed in your list of participants, there was no sites from the VA or first responders. Why is that? Is that because they've got their own systems and they're locking you out of it, or what?
The VA is incredibly difficult to work with. Judy Carlson, a doctoral level nurse at the VA in Honolulu, is running a controlled outcome, random controlled outcome study of ILF neurofeedback with active duty soldiers with multiple traumatic brain injuries. And the preliminary pilot study was so impressive. Well, one thing is she returned to active functioning a doctor who had an improvised device explode up next to him, and he was no longer capable of being a doctor. And so she did a pilot study on like 5 or 6, and the results were just that the VA pushed that study through. So it is in the VA through their research end. And she's doing another study. She's submitting for another study with the VA. So the VA is a very closed system. She's been in that system. She's doctoral level. She's a very impressive person about how she goes about it. So that's, otherwise we work with the VA only on homeless veterans. In other words, they've already been discharged. But it's you get into the VA and you can't stay in the VA because it's all, you need a commander to approve the work. The current commander approves it. They get everything going. The program runs for 2 or 3 years. A new commander comes in. He says, I don't like the program. It's done right there, and you don't have any data. So that. And in terms of first responders, we just took for our next training a group that's who they contract with. They contract with fire and police and EMTs to provide mental health services in Salt Lake City, Utah. And they treat over 200 of those people a year. So that's how we get in. You get the first, you get the second, and then after that, the word spreads, is what we hope.
Great.
So,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
and Tisha?
I might just be an odd one out here that I'm not a practicing neurofeedback therapist at the moment, but it's an area that was interesting to me. It was an email that I got, so I might be the odd one out here, but I am curious about recommendations for any training that would allow you to become a accredited practitioner.
I think at this point, I mean, what COVID forced the people who do the training to do it online at a distance, and that seems to have worked just fine. In fact, it's less disruptive, and you don't, no time zone changes and whatever. EEG Institute in LA does it. I know that if some sort of project was brought to Australia, that we would help get you the training. In other words, I don't know that our main trainer now is Roxana Sasu. I know she goes to Romania. She's a Romanian. So she's flown to Romania a couple times to train there. But if there was enough interest, I'm not sure how this goes forward, but one possibility is ANSA in some way goes on an arrangement to use the RTS and makes it available to members as part of membership. I don't know. These are discussions, but that also might then lead to bringing this training. I know there is somebody now in Australia who can provide the equipment, and I understand that the equipment has all the Australian approvals, medical approvals, that it be imported, that it can be.
Matt, when you're talking about the 40 hours training and the equipment and that kind of thing, the 40 hours training, is that's like the BCIA neurofeedback training, or are you talking about something different?
It's not BCIA because it was developed strictly around ILF. I was just talking to Angelica Sadar, who does lead BCIA courses, and she's looking at how to integrate ILF training into frequency band training. So that's a thing to be explored.
Matt, can I add? I actually done Sue's infralow frequency training online.
Okay.
You can do it. You can just buy it, and it's, I don't know how many hours, I don't know how many days, but it's beautifully done, and it's extremely worthwhile.
Yeah, because I'd like to do it. It's just finding the training and also the supervision and everything.
Right. I strongly believe that the training is not sufficient, you need supervision. That could be in the form of a weekly or bi-weekly call-ins. That's what we do. The other thing we're learning from the field is the first 60 days after training are hugely important, frequent contact, because people are nervous. ILF therapy in some ways is you really have to learn to read what's happening in front of you and interpret what's happening. And that's where somebody you can consult with during that first month to 2 months is usually beneficial. You get better outcomes.
Roger. Roger, you're muted.
Sorry, I had to find how to unmute myself. Look, I'm interested in the issues of training in the sense that we've developed the Neurofeedback Institute here in Sydney with Miriana and through STARTS, and I happen to chair the board of STARTS, so that's really my interest. But I'm really interested in the issues of not only the sort of initial training in terms of theoretical input, but how long do you think people should need supervision for after any of this sort of training, how frequently, because that really needs to be costed in a way to be able to get funding to give scholarships for people to train, or whatever mechanism we eventually find is effective.
So the way we do it is after the training, every other week we have an online 1-hour Zoom meeting. We have about 30 trainees who join in. We have several people who are highly skilled. I'll be one of them, Roxana, Virginia. We have about 4 people who could all be our trainers, who moderate. The last session, I did something different because I thought 2 of the people had sent me emails saying, I can't make it. Sorry about that. And I was short-staffed. When the meeting started, I said, there are several people in this group of 30 who've been doing this for more than 6 months, more than a year. Can I make you the leader of the breakout room? And they all said, sure. Okay, I'm nervous. I don't know what I'm doing. You sure I can do this? Yeah, you can do that. And then Roxana and I dropped in and out of the breakout rooms, and we kept our mouths mostly shut. And what we noticed is suddenly, because the expert was not leading the group, everybody else in the group was making input. And because they could see, you had to present your case, you had to bring it up on the RTS so you could see the protocols and the client's progress. The quality of the feedback from each other was good. And it was just natural that the therapists were much kinder. Us gurus, we'll tell you what to do. We don't shut up. Where the other people, it was a collaborative, and you just saw the level of expertise. So the answer is, after about 6 months, people have enough experience, if they're working with enough clients, to give feedback. And a year in, I could train them to be a trainer. Because we have the curriculum. We have all the things. And so they could then take that curriculum and lead it with a colleague. And yeah, they won't be so sure. They'll be a little bit nervous, but just like I'm going to butcher your name, sorry, Shayla, I'm sorry. It's difficult, particularly with ILF, to observe what's going on. But it's a skill you pick up, but you need the collaboration, you need the feedback. Yes, that's right. Or, yeah, I've had that, and no, we could not figure out on that one. But after a year, I don't think that you get better with 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road. The protocol manual is only so thick. We only use 5 sites. So cost-wise, being able to use Zoom, and now you're starting to rely on volunteers. And the thing is those people like to be breakout room leaders. It was a recognition that they've come up in their status. And then also, so the cost of this stuff, I've looked at that. Once the training materials are developed, it's doable. Ideally, you would get a couple master's programs in counseling to start offering a certification in neurofeedback. But the problem with that is once you've learned it, your knowledge is fixed. And this is a field, we get new protocols and changes to our software regularly. And so the university-based training, as opposed to the hands-on active in the field, the latter is better. Okay. So.
It's 11:44. We went well over time. Matthew, thank you so much for giving us this presentation. It's something that we will follow up on. So we'll discuss this further with Tansa and come back to you. I hope that your program will also take a ground in Australia. We need to advocate on behalf of our clients and to help to develop neurofeedback in other services where is really needed. This is a great example, and I've learned a lot, and I think that everyone got a lot of information that we can, and things to process and think about. So this was really, it was very generous of you to come. Thank you. Thank you, Matthew.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you also. Close to 2 hours is a long time to sit and listen to a presentation, so I appreciate all of you, and I look forward to hearing what happens.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Rest well.
Okay. So I'll say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.